Hey everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Reviews and How-Tos, the series where I take you on an adventure, basically explaining how you can play your favorite board games as well as giving them a review. So if you're ever curious about how you can brush up on your skills about a specific game, or if you have no idea about a game at all and you want to learn a little bit more, then this is the series for you. And we're going to be starting it off with one of the greatest board games or tabletop role-playing games ever made, and that is Dungeons and Dragons. So Dungeons and Dragons is an incredibly complex game, but there is a reason why it is the most popular tabletop game to this day. And it is because it is incredibly engaging, and it is limited only by your imagination. So we're going to be taking you through the different steps it takes into playing Dungeons and Dragons, and of course breaking down the relationship between player and Dungeon Master. So I brought up Player and Dungeon Master right now because those are the two different pieces you need to have an effective Dungeons and Dragons game. Ultimately, they serve completely different roles. The Dungeon Master exists to explain the story and what is happening so that the player understands their current situation and the decisions they get to make. I'm going to break down this section into two different parts, the player and then the Dungeon Master. So let's start talking about the player. So you are a brand new player who has never played Dungeons and Dragons before. What do you do? Well, of course, you've got to start by creating your character. And the character creation was actually one of the most complex steps and most difficult steps for me to learn. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of this video explaining how you can create your character effectively. Now, every character needs to be built off of a sheet like this, called your character sheet. Now, not every sheet is going to look exactly the same as this. You can go online and find a wide variety of different styles of sheets, but they all serve the exact same function. And that is basically to give you the skills and attributes, the races and the skills of your characters so you can create a well-rounded character. Now, I don't mean to intimidate anybody, but character creation for Dungeons and Dragons is by far the most complex step within the Dungeons and Dragons game. The rest of it is incredibly simple and straightforward, but there's a lot of different layers you've got to look at when creating a character, so we're going to go very in-depth in this video in that regard. But I would also like to say, if character creation does seem too complex for you, then you can also go online. You can go to the official Dungeons and Dragons website or even Dungeons and Dragons Beyond to find a wide selection of pre-made characters that you can select from. So step one of creating your Dungeons and Dragons character, choosing your race and your class. In Dungeons and Dragons, there's a wide variety of races and classes for you to choose from. All will impact the weapons you start off with, as well as your attributes, and eventually the powers and the skills you can unlock in the future. There are 9 different races and 12 different classes to choose from in the base game's player's handbook. These races include humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, dragonborns, high elves, half-orcs, and tieflings. And all of these races have unique attributes, such as humans, who are great all-rounders, elves, who are known for their greater dexterity, dwarves, who have a high constitution score, hobbits are great for stealthy classes, gnomes are tinkerers, the dragonborns feature superior strength and high charisma, half-elves are a great mix of humanity and elvenkind and have a high charisma score, half-orcs are looking for battle, they are tanks in the field, and of course tieflings, who have increased charisma and improved intelligence. But don't limit yourself to the characters I've just told you about. If you do more research online, you'll be able to see that there are over 40 different playable races that you can choose from. And hopefully it goes without saying, but since you've just chosen your race, you know your race's attributes. It is always recommended that you choose a class that complements your race's attributes. For example, if I want to select a fighter, then of course I'm going to choose an orc because the attributes go together quite well. But the different fighting classes we have are fighter, barbarian, warlock, paladin, ranger, monk, rogue, cleric, sorcerer, bard, druid, and wizard. Of course, all of these classes have unique attributes that make them unique, that make them stand out from the rest, and ultimately it's up to you, the player, to find out what class you enjoy playing with the most. I've personally always found myself struggling with magic-built characters like wizards or druids, so I tend to step away from those and stick to simpler classes such as fighters, barbarians, and sometimes paladins if I want to get a little bit more experimental. And then finally, it's time for you to settle on a background for your character. This helps fleshing out your character just a little bit more, as well as giving them additional skills. I would highly recommend that you check out the Dungeons and Dragons playbook for the 13 official player backgrounds. Now it comes to properly filling in your character sheet. At its core, Dungeons & Dragons is all about chance and mathematics. So let's break that down now. To start off, you'll need 6 core abilities: your strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. These ability scores, or rather stats, are what determine your character's strengths and weaknesses. The most common methods to decide these values are the standard array, where you'll put pre-selected scores of 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8 into the abilities of your choice, or you can roll 3d6s 6 times and use these 6 totals as your ability scores. A d6 is your traditional 6-sided dice, but I'll break down dice later on in the video. You can also then use a d20 and roll that 6 times. And while this might give you a good chance of reaching higher scores, it also gives you a much greater chance of scoring incredibly low, giving yourself a natty 1 or anything below an 8. Of course, if you want to be a little bit more safe about your character creation, you can always roll your dice first and then find a race that has similar attributes to what you've been assigned. Once you've gotten your skills or stats, you then have to worry about your character modifiers. Basically, modifiers work in twos. A score of 12 or 13 is +1, a score of 14 or 15 is +2, and so on. Unfortunately, this also means that a score of less than 10, such as a strength score of 8, will give you a modifier of -1. These modifiers give you just a little bit more help when you're in a pinch, or of course when times are truly desperate, can cost you greatly. At the end of the day, these modifiers mean that when a dungeon master asks you to roll your d20 for a specific skill, you can then add your modifiers, either making your score greater or weaker. But we'll get into that step of the game soon. Once you've figured out your skills and your modifiers, it's time for you to move on to your hit points and your armor class. Every class has a different hit dice that varies from a d4 up to a d12. From first level, you'll take the highest possible score and add the bonus from your constitution modifier. Let's say, for example, I'm using a wizard, that's a d4, but let's say I have a high constitution, which gives me a modifier of +2, then my HP will be 6. While playing Dungeons & Dragons, you can then also upgrade your character. Every time you get enough experience points to level up, you will use this exact same system again. Take the dice that's assigned to your character, roll it, and add your constitution points. Then we move on to our armor class, or AC. The easiest way to work this out is to remember that every character's unarmored AC skill is 10, with their dexterity modifier added onto that. And then on top of that, you also have the abilities to wear light, medium, or heavy armor, as well as using a shield. Once you've selected all of these different things, you can then add it to your armor class, and it will impact your overall AC, which will give you more protection in battle. And ultimately, through those steps, you have filled in majority of your character sheet. And that is a great place to start with Dungeons & Dragons. So after filling in your character sheets, you are ready to play Dungeons & Dragons. So let's break down how the game is played. In most circumstances, Dungeons & Dragons is broken down into 3 steps. The first step, the Dungeon Master describes something. This can be the atmosphere, the surroundings, or an event that is taking place. The second step is when you, the player, decides what to do, and you take an action. The Dungeon Master will then ask you to roll your d20 and will figure out if that decision to make that action was successful. Those 3 steps will then repeat over and over and over again, and that is how you play Dungeons & Dragons. Now, earlier in the video, I did mention the different types of dice you get. Of course, you don't have to go as overboard as me with your dice collections, but you do have to get yourself a good set of dice. If you are a player in the Dungeons & Dragons campaign, then you're going to need to get yourself a 7 dice set. This 7 dice set includes a d4, d6, d8, d10, d12, and d20. But you'll find yourself using your d20 more than any other dice. Now that we've discussed the dice, let's move into combat. Ultimately, when combat takes place, your Dungeon Master will ask you to roll your initiative. In doing so, you will roll a d20 and then add your initiative score. The Dungeon Master will then take everyone's initiative score and put you into a list. That list will dictate what order the combat takes place in. Once you've entered a combat situation, the Dungeon Master will then guide you through whose turn it is in which situation. The simplest way to break down combat is simply to describe what you want to do. The Dungeon Master will then ask you to make a roll with your d20, and if you roll higher than the target's AC score, then you've made a successful hit, and then you can roll one of your other dice for damage. The dice you roll for damage depends entirely on the type of weapon you are using. So once you've figured out your weapons, you'll find out what dice are allocated to that specific weapon. You can then also add your modifiers to that weapon. While this might all sound incredibly complicated, I can guarantee you that it is so much more easily done than said. And ultimately, that is how you, the player, can engage with Dungeons and Dragons. The only limitation is your imagination. Go out there and do whatever you want, as long as you don't piss off your dungeon master. Before we carry on with the video, I do just want to say, if you're at all curious as to where you can get your own Dungeons and Dragons books like this, or any of the starter or essential kits, then I'd highly recommend that you check out Solarpop. Solarpop has very quickly become my Dungeons and Dragons go-to shop. So if you're requiring anything from them, from campaign books to kits to dice, I would highly recommend that you check out Solarpop. Then, of course, we get to the DM, the infamous Dungeon Master. It is your job to tell the story that the players are going to be going on. There are 3 different ways you can do this. Firstly, you can create home-brewed campaigns. Now, while this might be a lot of fun and give you a lot of power, it then places a lot of responsibility on your shoulders, because you are going to have to think of every single situation and scenario that the players can get up to. If you're looking to find something a little bit more easier to dip your toes into in regard to dungeon mastering, then you can also check online for pre-made campaigns. And then moving forward from that, you can also check out the official Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. Right here, I have got 2 different Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, and I've played through both and had an absolutely fantastic, phenomenal time. I would highly recommend that if it is your first foray into being a DM for Dungeons and Dragons, then you definitely want to check out one of their official campaign books. As a Dungeon Master, you'll also have access to books like this, the Dungeon Master's Guide. You're going to want to take advantage of books like this to give you all of the tools that you will need to tell a compelling and exciting story. At the end of the day, the responsibility of telling a fun, engaging story falls to the Dungeon Master. If you are a Dungeon Master, I would highly recommend that you do a sufficient amount of research before starting the campaign, because there is nothing more immersive or immersion breaking than a Dungeon Master who doesn't know where the campaign is heading. Of course, there is so much more to being a DM than just telling the story. You've got to be the one that tracks the combat, the one that tracks the progress of the story, the one who handles the experience points. But thankfully, all of that is handled in the books I've mentioned before, or if you have an official Dungeons and Dragons DM board, you'll be able to look on the back of your board for more information like that. And that is how you can play Dungeons and Dragons. Yes, I understand this has been a long video, and I understand it has been very, very complex, but I can guarantee you there is a reason why Dungeons and Dragons is one of the most popular tabletop RPG games of all time. And it is because it is limitless. You are limited only by your imagination. So guys, let's get into my review of Dungeons and Dragons. And I just have to say, this is a game that is almost impossible to review, because I know I've spoken about how complex the systems are. I've spoken about how limitless the system is, but that's exactly how it is. The pure enjoyment you get out of this game is limited only by your own imagination and the quality of your Dungeon Master. So if you have a high quality Dungeon Master, if you have someone that's truly passionate about Dungeons and Dragons, if you have someone who knows what they're doing, and if you're with a group of friends who truly wants to immerse themselves in the world of Dungeons and Dragons, you're going to have a phenomenal time. I remember my friends and I went on a complete tangent, broke into a bar, got into a massive fight, and the only way to get out of it was to convince the guards who tried to arrest us that we were entertainers, much like, WWE wrestlers. And so we actually put an entire wrestling match on to convince these guards. And we had to end up bringing out a fake championship, and there was a fake champion reigned, and everything like that. That's how complex this game can get. That had nothing to do with the primary campaign. But on the flip side, I've had one of the worst Dungeons and Dragons games I can ever explain, where no one understood what was happening. The Dungeon Master was so clearly uninterested in the campaign that after even just 3 hours, we decided to just call it because no one was having fun. So I'm going to give Dungeons and Dragons a 9 out of 10, because even though this can be the most phenomenal game ever, and I truly want to give it a 10 out of 10, there are those situations where you can be put with an incredibly lackluster group of people who can just drag the game down. But guys, thank you so much for watching reviews and how-tos. I really appreciate you guys spending time and dedicating time out of your day to consume my content. It really does mean the world to me. If you guys did enjoy this video and you found it useful, please give it a like. Comment down below if you have any questions whatsoever. Do not be afraid to subscribe to my YouTube channel and let me know what games you want me to review next. Awesome guys, thank you so much.